This is the Olympus 15mm f8 body cap lens with the model number BCL-1580. It was first announced in 2012, so it's an old lens. And to my knowledge, this is the smallest and lightest lens ever made. It weighs 22 grams and its thickness is 9 millimeters, so that's 9 millimeters from the protruding part when connected to the camera. And it's made from plastic. It doesn't have a filter thread and there's no lens hood thread neither. It has a built-in cap which you can cover the lens with a lever, and it has manual focus, so there's no electronics on the lens. So it has a small lever and there's 3 preset positions for that, which you can use for zone focusing. So there's a position for 30 centimeters and then distant, and distant isn't actually stated what that means, but I think it's around from 3 meters to 8 meters. And because it's an f8 lens, everything will be in focus anyway. And then you have another position for infinity. So 30 centimeters, distant, and infinity. The closest focusing distance is 30 centimeters, but in reality, it seems to be around 25 centimeters or 26 centimeters. And the diagonal angle of view is 72 degrees. The disadvantages of this lens is that it lacks a focusing ring, so it means you can't have fine grain control over the focusing. So there's a few workarounds for that. So one of the things is that you can use the focus peaking on the camera. So if you enable that, that helps a little bit with the focusing, although it's still not perfect because it's an f8 lens, so a lot of things will be in focus regardless. And another feature you can use to help with the focusing is the punch-in zoom. But in my opinion, I don't think you should attempt to focus using this lens. I think the best thing is to just use the presets, so zone focusing. So whether you set it at 30 centimeters or distant or infinity, I tend to put it on the distant range and then just keep it there for video recording. Another disadvantage of this lens is that it's not good for low light situations because it has an f8 aperture. So one thing that helps with low light situations if you want to take photographs is to enable sensor stabilization. But since the lens doesn't have electronics, it cannot communicate the focal length to the camera. So you need to go into the camera and manually configure this. And if you use this lens frequently, then you can just save a profile with this lens. So tell the camera that this is a 15mm lens, and then the camera will use that for the image stabilization. Overall, the optical performance of this lens is not good. So I wouldn't recommend it for photography, but I think for video work, it's good. On one of the websites where they test the optical performance of lenses, this lens has scored the lowest out of every lens ever. But one of the things about that website is that they don't take into account other advantages such as low cost, low weight, and small size. And the other thing is that that particular website seems to focus on photography as opposed to video work. And the difference is that when you're taking photographs, the sensor takes a larger reading and it uses a bigger portion of the image circle, which means it includes more of the corners of the lens. Hence, the quality will be slightly reduced for those tests. In terms of the advantages of this lens, in my experience, this lens is good for video footage. First of all, because newer cameras compensate to a certain extent for the performance of the lens. So this lens performs better today than it did in 2012 when it was first announced, simply because newer cameras have more dynamic range and higher resolutions, and they perform better in low light situations. And the second thing when it comes to video recording is that the camera oversamples the sensor, so the output quality of video appears better at the resolution and size at which the video is viewed in comparison to still photos. Also, video recording uses the central part of the image circle, which is sharper than the edges, whereas photographs include more of the edges, which have substantially lower quality. And if you use digital stabilization, then the edges will be further cropped out anyway. Although using digital stabilization reduces the overall sharpness, because effectively what happens is the image is cropped and then stretched out. So I think it's better not to use digital stabilization, even though it crops out the edges. So just using sensor stabilization, in my experience, provides the best results. Also, when it comes to video recording, because video contains motion blur, the lack of extreme sharpness is less of an issue for video footage, as it won't be as visible as in photos. And extremely sharp video footage looks unnatural, which is why some people add a physical filter in front of their lens to reduce extreme sharpness when using a sharp lens for video work. So this lens doesn't require a filter for reduction of sharpness as it already has a natural look. So in my opinion, this lens is good for video work, in particular for live streaming. When you're doing live streaming, the stream quality typically suffers because of the low upload bandwidth and the encoding on the streaming platform, as opposed to the lens which is being used. For example, YouTube encoding reduces the quality of any video substantially, and even more so when it's a live stream. And upload speed limitations means lower bitrate is used when you're doing live streaming. So for example, if I'm uploading a normal video to YouTube, it might be between 100 megabits per second up to 240 megabits per second. But if I'm live streaming something, it will probably be 10 megabits per second, 20 megabits per second at most. And that's because of the upload speed limitations. Another good use for this lens, because it only weighs 22 grams, is when you want to attach the camera somewhere. So if you want to attach it with a magic arm or a clamp to do, let's just say, overhead videos, or attach it to a bicycle or a pole or somewhere to record things, then because it's so light, it's easy to attach it anywhere. Whereas if you have a big, large lens, it would be more difficult to attach it to certain places and you need a stronger rig to be able to hold on to it. So just to give a few tips in terms of maximizing the image quality with this lens. First of all, don't use digital stabilization, but only use sensor stabilization. So you keep the maximum reading from the sensor. And the second thing is to use it in bright conditions so that the ISO can be kept low to maximize dynamic range and color accuracy and reduce any noise. And the third thing is to ensure there's no direct light hitting the lens to avoid flares or the washed up type of look that you get when there's a lot of light hitting the lens directly. Because this is more of an issue on these type of cheap lenses as opposed to, for example, the Olympus M.Zuiko lenses. They have certain coatings which seems to handle the light hitting the lens directly much better. And in terms of being able to focus easier, one thing is to use focus peaking on the camera, and the other one is to use punch-in focusing. And typically, if you configure two shortcut buttons for these two features, it's easy to use them quite quickly whenever you need to. So you enable focus peaking and punch-in zoom together, and that helps with the focusing if you want to do really accurate focusing. And my final tip in relation to using this lens is to use zone focusing presets that are available on the lens, as opposed to attempting to focus accurately. In my experience, that works best, particularly for video. I just set it to distant, and then because it's a f8 aperture lens, everything will be in focus anyway. So just to compare this lens to a few other lenses, but before I compare it to other lenses, just to compare it to the Olympus BC2 Body Cap. So this is not a lens, this is just a cap that you put on the camera. In terms of the thickness, there's only 3 millimeters difference between them. So a body cap is 6 millimeters, whereas this lens is 9 millimeters. So that's how small the difference is. And the weight of a body cap is 9 grams, whereas the weight of this lens is 22 grams. So the difference is only 13 grams. So if we compare it to the Olympus 9mm f8 fisheye body cap lens, although this might be a bad comparison because there are different focal lengths, 9mm versus 15mm, and the 9mm is a fisheye lens, whereas the 15mm is a rectilinear lens. But I think these are the only two body cap lenses that Olympus has made, so that's why I think it's worth doing a quick comparison. So in terms of the fisheye 9mm f8 lens, it's 12.8 millimeters, but the 15mm lens is 9 millimeters, so the fisheye lens is 4 millimeters thicker. And in terms of weight, the fisheye body cap lens is 30 grams, whereas the 15mm rectilinear lens is 22 grams. So the fisheye lens is 8 grams heavier. And in terms of focal length, it's a 9mm fisheye, so if it was rectilinear, it would actually be even less than 9mm, whereas this one is 15 millimeters. So if you want a wider look, then obviously the fisheye lens is better, but you do get the fisheye effect. In my personal usage, I do like wider lenses, but I don't really like the fisheye effect. So that's why I think the 15mm one is better in that sense. So the fisheye lens will give a strong barrel distortion, so the picture is curved. But at the same time, one of the advantages of the fisheye lens is that more of the image will be in focus, simply because it's a really wide lens. And the diagonal angle of view for the fisheye lens is 140 degrees versus the 72 degrees on the 15mm body cap lens. The closest focusing distance from the sensor using the 9mm fisheye lens is 20 centimeters, whereas on the 15mm body cap lens is 30 centimeters. So the closest focusing distance is also shorter for the fisheye lens. Another bad comparison for this lens is the Panasonic Leica 15mm f1.7, but I just thought I mentioned it anyway. So if you want a lens which is really good and is 15mm, then I think the Panasonic Leica is obviously a much better lens, but it's substantially more expensive. It's 5 times heavier, it's 4 times bigger, but it is a really good lens. And it has an aperture of 1.7, so you have flexibility of using the aperture at 1.7 if you're in a dark environment, and then you can ramp up the aperture if you need to get more depth of field. Another pancake lens worth mentioning is the Panasonic Lumix 14mm f2.5 Mark II. This lens is also quite small and light, so it weighs 55 grams, which is 2.5 times heavier than the 15mm body cap lens, but it's still really light because it's only 55 grams. And in terms of thickness, it's about 2 centimeters, whereas the body cap lens is less than 1 centimeter. So essentially the 14mm Panasonic lens is over twice as big. So a few more differences between the Panasonic lens and the body cap lens is that the Panasonic 14mm lens has a lens cap as opposed to a lever to cover the lens, and the Panasonic lens also has a filter thread, so you can use the filter thread to attach a filter, or you can use it to attach a lens hood for it. But you can't keep the lens hood on the lens because it will interfere with the lens cap itself. So you would have to screw and unscrew the lens hood or the filter every time you want to put on or take off the lens cap, unless you find a lens cap which covers the lens hood instead of putting the lens cap on the lens itself. You can put the lens cap on the lens hood, but you need to buy a bigger lens cap which fits the bigger lens hood, obviously. So one of the advantages of the Panasonic 14mm is that it has electronics. So there's contacts between the lens and the camera. So it will send information about its focal length and EXIF metadata to the camera. So you don't need to manually configure that in the camera. And when you take a picture, all that information about what settings the picture was taken with will be saved as part of the metadata for the picture. And the Panasonic lens allows you to set the aperture from anywhere between f2.5 all the way up to f22, whereas the Olympus body cap lens is fixed at f8, so you can't go higher and you can't go lower neither. There's a few other lenses which I don't have, so one is the AstrHori 14mm f4.5, so that's another pancake lens, and there's also the 7 Artisans 18mm f6.3 Mark II. So those are also 2 pancake lenses worth considering. But aside from the lenses that I mentioned, there's a few zoom lenses that are worth thinking about if you're considering buying a pancake lens. So when you want to buy a pancake lens, the priority I assume would be size and weight. So Panasonic has a 12 to 32mm f3.5 to f5.6 lens. So that gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of range from 12mm all the way up to 32mm, which includes the 15mm focal range as well, obviously. And you can set the aperture to f22 if you wanted to. And that lens also only weighs 70 grams. And in terms of thickness is 2.4 centimeters. So that lens is really light, but it gives you a lot of flexibility at the same time. Another zoom lens worth considering is the Olympus M.Zuiko 14 to 42mm f3.5 to f5.6 with an electronic zoom. And this lens weighs 93 grams. And again, the aperture ranges from f3.5 to f22. So you have a lot of flexibility both in terms of the aperture and also the focal length. And one of the advantages of this M.Zuiko lens is that it automatically opens up and it automatically closes, and there's a lens hood for it which operates automatically. So it's a lot more practical and easier to use. You don't have to configure the camera to put in the focal length for image stabilization or the EXIF metadata. And the lens cap opens automatically. It has autofocus. It has a focus ring. It has a zoom ring. You can operate it remotely by an app since it has an electronic zoom. So it has a lot of flexibility. Panasonic has a lens which is almost identical to the Olympus M.Zuiko 14 to 42mm, although that performs a little bit worse in all areas. So in terms of zoom, making more sound when recording video, the image quality seems to be a tiny bit worse, and it weighs a tiny bit more. So the Panasonic Lumix 14 to 42mm f3.5 to f5.6 weighs 95 grams, and its aperture ranges from f3.5 to f5.6 at the telephoto end, and you can obviously set it all the way up to f22. And it's a little bit bigger than the Olympus lens as well, so it's 2.7 centimeters. And it doesn't have a focus ring and it doesn't have a zoom ring, but it has a lever for zooming in and out. So those are the Pancake lenses that I think are worth considering, but none of them are as light and small as the Olympus 15mm F8 Body Cap Lens. So if you want something that's really, really light, this is a really good lens. But if you're willing to sacrifice a little bit on the size and weight, then I think one of those zoom lenses from Olympus or Panasonic are probably better, more practical, particularly the Panasonic Lumix 12 to 32mm, because the range it has is really good. So it's quite wide at 12mm and it goes up to 32mm, which I think is quite practical for video recording, because anything above that, that's when you start to see more shaky footage, and that lens only weighs 70 grams. So that's another choice to think about if you're looking for a Pancake lens. There are a few other Pancake lenses, and they've attempted to essentially improve the quality. But one of the disadvantages of improving the quality of a Pancake lens is that it starts to become heavier and bigger. So it defies the objective of being a Pancake lens, which is why I think the Olympus and Panasonic zoom lenses are better, because they still are really, really light and they provide a lot of flexibility, which other Pancake lenses don't provide. Anyway, let me know if you have any questions about this lens or if you want me to compare it in more depth with any other lens.